If immigration continues at 700,000 a year or even close, there is no way that reform is a flash in the pan.
I'm Ben Houchin. This is the Blueprint Podcast, brought to you by Conservative Home, and we're going to lift the lid on centre-right politics in the UK. We're going to be speaking with influential figures from across the political spectrum to help understand how we can make centre-right politics relevant to people's lives again and turn it back into a political force for good. Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Blueprint Podcast with Conservative Home. Today we have a fantastic guest, Juliet Samuel, who is a journalist at The Times, formerly of The Telegraph, and who writes on all things politics, public policy and economics. Juliet, thank you very much for coming on to the Blueprint Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So we tend to start these things off before we get into the nitty-gritty of politics and issues of the day, finding a little bit more about our guests. We've got lots of people who are interested in politics generally but may not know all of the guests that we have on. So I didn't realise, I did a little bit of research, Juliet, and I knew obviously quite a lot about you, but I didn't realise that you started your professional career at Guido.
Yes,
Guido Fawkes blog.
I did. And I was at the 20th anniversary dinner, which was actually Paul Staines's sort of retirement celebration from Guido 2 weeks ago. So,
is he stepping back? I didn't realise.
Yeah, he is. I mean, he's too restless to not be up to something, but he's officially not Guido Fawkes anymore.
Is he not? Do we have a replacement?
Yes,
or is it
Ross Kempsell, Lord Ross Kempsell.
It is? Right, I didn't realise he was actually stepping into the big shoes.
Yeah, he is. Yeah, he's got control of the Twitter account, so now you know.
Oh, dangerous if Ross has got control of the Twitter account. So if you started at Guido, I mean, how did that come about then? Because you came out of university to do that, or were you doing something before then?
So I was at university in the US, and I was deep in a libertarian phase of my politics, and I'd had a bit of some activity with journalism over there in libertarian circles. I'd worked at Reason magazine for a summer. I'd been to a few kind of conferences for students, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And then the Guido Fawkes blog came onto the radar for me with the Smeargate leak.
Oh, yeah.
Which, for anyone who remembers, was basically a leaked email that Paul obtained of the then Prime Minister Gordon Brown's top spin doctor plotting to smear political opponents, and it's sort of led to a 5-point drop in Labour's poll rating. Anyway, that brought the blog to my attention, and then they said they were recruiting for interns. I didn't have a plan after university, so I wrote to him, and I think because of that, I had a few sort of things on my CV that made him think we might get along. And so I started there making videos, basically.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Were you always intending to come back to the UK then? After?
Well, I was only intending to come back for a few years, and then I thought I might go back to the US. But then things just sort of took off a bit, and I didn't want to leave. So.
Had you always wanted to be in the US when you were younger then? Is that why you
No,
went to
not at all. I only went there because I had a year out after school to decide what to do. I wasn't sure where I would get into university over here. My oldest sister lived over there, in Boston.
Did she study out there as well? Or?
No, she moved out there with her partner at the time. I mean, Boston is an amazing city. It has 13 universities, I think, or something like that. So it's a real grad student town, actually. Anyway, so I'd visited a few places. So so that's why I went over there. I think partly I was trying to escape the British class system as well, if I'm honest. Having been to private schools, and I knew those crowds, and had a rough idea of the cliques they formed when they went off to university, and I found the idea quite unexciting. Whereas you go to the US, you can kind of shake things up and be anyone you want, at least for a few years, because you're an outsider in that system. So that was why I'd gone over there. But I always had thought I might come back.
And you touched upon going through a libertarian phase as you were kind of looking towards Guido, and I suppose your time at Harvard as well. When you were younger, were you a bit of a kind of a firebrand libertarian from the off, or?
Yeah. So, when I was 16, I had a brief Marxist phase.
Oh, did you?
Yes, very brief.
How did that
probably
come about?
6 months.
Going from Marxism to libertarianism in one fell swoop.
Yeah, there's a kind of satisfaction to the idea of dialectical materialism. It's a very neat theory. So, you know, I think that's what briefly seduced me about Marxism. And then I went to the US and I discovered this thing called libertarianism. And I thought, that's what I am.
So that's not something you'd seen at your time in the UK at school or anything?
No, not at all. And I don't know if it's more prevalent now, you know, if we absorb American political culture more quickly now than we did then. This was 2005-ish. Anyway, I went over there, decided that was what I was reading various political philosophy. And I think what underlay it was a general skepticism about the state and its competence, and a general feeling of not wanting to be controlled, which I think is, you know, it fits with youth really.
Yeah, it does.
And a suspicion of authority.
So you flirted with Marxism and then libertarianism more in the US. Was politics something that was always on your radar, even as a kid then? And if so, how did that come?
I don't know how I got infected with it.
Not your parents?
It's never been cured.
We find a lot of conversations we have with people, it tends to be, maybe not overtly the parents as in they are a conservative or, you know, socialist or whatever it might be, but politics tends to be quite a topic in people's households.
My parents are both conservatives, although quite different kinds of conservatives from each other.
Okay.
And there were always debates at the table, at the dining table. I mean, they weren't. I wouldn't say there was a lot of feeling that you should go into politics, but that was where the exciting discussions happened. And you know, I'm one of 5 siblings, so obviously there are power struggles between siblings, and it was sort of played out through debates and, you know, who could best one another in some ways.
Yeah.
I was the 4th of 5, so I couldn't usually best anyone, but that's probably what made it exciting to me and got me interested.
And what was because obviously you then went to Guido, and then career shows that you go into journalism quite significantly. Was there ever a point in which you thought a career in politics might be for you rather than journalism, or was journalism something that always interested you as well?
No, I'd always wanted to write.
Oh, had you?
Yes, I always liked writing.
Anything in particular? Fiction, non-fiction?
Both really. Yeah. So I'd always enjoyed it. I'd always found it easy at school to do well in writing, been told that I was good at it, and it just was the natural way for me to express myself. So journalism seemed an obvious thing to try out. Politics itself, I think there are definitely too many things about it that are not suited to my character. I think you really have to be an extrovert, enjoy meeting complete strangers and be energized by that all the time. And
you find that you're a bit more of an introvert? Yeah,
I'm more of a... I do like speaking to new people, you know, who are doing things that I've never thought of doing, or, you know, going and meeting businesses or, you know, people designing new things. That does energize me, but it's not the interpersonal aspect of it that energizes me. It's the project.
The intellectual stimulation of the thing
we're engaged in.
Yeah, okay.
And I think to be a natural politicians should be people, you know, people.
Or maybe not. Maybe we've got too many people and performers in politics.
I don't know. I think when you get that rare politician who really can change things, they have some way of connecting with people that comes quite naturally to them. Whatever it is, whether it's a burning conviction that sort of draws people in to them. I think that's probably the sort of Margaret Thatcher style, or Kemi Badenoch actually I think has that quality, or whether it's just real charisma like Boris Johnson. I think you've got to have that kind of quality, really.
Not so much Keir Starmer then?
No. He's probably a good lawyer.
Yeah.
But
is that a compliment? All right.
It would be if he'd stuck to law, but unfortunately he went into politics.
But then, so when you obviously then left university and joined Guido and then moved on, it was an interesting time because it was about 2009, 2010, moving into a Conservative government, 14 years of a Conservative government. What are your reflections on how that whole 14-year period went. Because there are lots of different parts, lots of different administrations within that. But what's your, looking back now retrospectively, what's your feeling of how it went? What went well? What went wrong? What can we learn from?
I think there was never really a project about what the country should become. The nearest Cameron and his guys got to a project was austerity. But austerity is not a project. Austerity is a measure, a measure you have to take for safety. You know, it's a negative project almost. But I think, you know, it's a reaction to what had gone before, which was an expansion of the state. I mean, they never really did shrink the state, actually. But I think that's the closest they got to having a vision for the country. And
is that more events, though, rather than... Because before the crash in 2008, 2009, did you not think they had a vision for what they wanted the country to be that was blown off track as a result of that, and therefore austerity became the agenda? Or
no,
not
really. No, I think it was a project to win power, detoxify, you know, pick the right political angle on what was going on, and what was going on was the financial crisis and too much debt. And, you know, a few years before they'd, you know, been cheerleading the expansion of the financial sector just as much as anyone else. And before that, you know, very pro-Iraq war. And there were always constitutional conservatives who I think were very worried and sceptical about what the Blair era had done to British governance. But I don't think there was anything that really drew it together into something as concrete as an idea of where the country really should be going.
You didn't get an impression from that from Theresa May either? No. It feels like Boris had a vision.
Boris, I think, did have a vision. And I think when you read his book, he's obviously also good at projecting back in time something that was probably a little more chaotic than it appears in the narrative. But I do think...
But separate from the practicalities and the chaoticness of the administration, the idea that he was coming into power or wanting to come into power as the Prime Minister with a vision for what he wanted the country to be. Yeah,
I do think there is a paragraph or a page in his book where he describes going on some kind of visit with... I think David Cameron and George Osborne, or one of them certainly, and he's looking out the window at some really underinvested part of the UK with, you know, a depressing high street. And he's thinking, you know, why can't we do something about this? We must do something about this. Whereas the Cameron Osborne project was really in the Blair vein of, well, the South is going to make all the wealth, and what we'll do for these guys is to hand out checks through the government. And I do think, you know, he had a skepticism of that vision that was well justified, and a sense that, no, we should be fixing these issues and finding out what they are. I'm not sure it was as, you know, it was slightly inchoate in that way, but I think, you know, as far as that then came to levelling up, I think there was something there before, you know, many years before he came to power.
As in, he had an idea percolating, or you saw...
Yeah, and an idea of, you know, wasted potential and deep-seated problems that shouldn't just be left to fester, or that couldn't just be bailed out with money, but that should be addressed and examined.
So if forgive me, Juliet, but it sounds like you had a relatively cynical view of kind of the lack of, I suppose, principle or ideology of each of the Conservative administrations, or is that not quite fair?
This is, I mean, yes, of the Cameroon project. I mean, I feel less cynical about Boris and what he was trying to do. You know, I mean, ultimately it's his own fault he never managed to do it, because he didn't run a functional enough government to achieve, you know, half of what he wanted to.
I mean, some of the optimists amongst us would say, or who are now frustrated, would kind of feel like, well, he was Prime Minister for a while, but then had to deal with Brexit, and then we had the election in December 2019, and it was only 4 months after that kind of COVID really blew the whole regime out of the water.
When you say he had to deal with Brexit, he led us into the glorious
He
future of
Absolutely,
Brexit. Well, he eventually got it done, but there was a massive failure of statesmanship after the Brexit vote, which he himself, I think, admits
In what way?
now. Well, there was that weekend. The vote had come through on the Friday. There was a celebratory feeling among many people who'd really wanted it, but I think in the political sphere there was a shell-shocked feeling of, oh my God, they did it, we did it, now what? And I think Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, all those guys were as shell-shocked as anyone else, if not more. And what was needed was for one of them to come on our TV screens and say, this is what this means, this is where we're going to take ourselves, now the future's open to us, in a way that was both reassuring and inspiring. And instead what we got was paralysis and, them going to lunch and to play cricket, and then there was panic, and that's why we then had the stab in the back by Michael Gove, and then the whole fallout that led to Boris not running. I mean, he didn't even run for leader at that point. He didn't have. He was scared, and so we got Theresa May, and so that was his failure, really, that he wasn't able to rise to that moment, which he was able to create the moment, but he wasn't able to make something of it.
But then obviously he came back and got Brexit done and actually took us out after many shenanigans and all sorts. I think it's probably fair to say many of those people involved didn't necessarily appreciate the backlash and the pushback that the state was going to give to the Brexit results. And I think even now, I think there's a lack of understanding of just how the system is still pushing to reject Brexit.
Yes.
I mean, you would argue that's the biggest failure, but I suppose Boris would say he recognised some of that, which is why he brought people in like Dominic Cummings, who is part of Vote Leave, and people always said this during the referendum, which frustrated me, which was there is no plan for Brexit, there is no implementation. I mean, Vote Leave produced basically a significantly weighty Bible of exactly what process you would go through post-Brexit. Matthew Elliott and the team deserve a lot of credit for that. But it felt like to me Dom was supposed to be the solution that was going to implement Brexit. But I think even he found the system much more difficult than he was expecting.
He did, but it was a mix of problems. So he himself was too chaotic to actually to wield power. What you needed basically was someone, I don't know if someone in between or Boris and Dom Cummings, or whether or someone alongside them or whatever it was, but you needed someone who had an iron grip of basic things like scheduling, planning. Are all the documents in the right place? What decision has been made at this meeting? Who's attending this meeting? Which meetings need to happen? Basic stuff which basically no one ever got a hold of. So you had brilliant people like Boris Johnson, like Dominic Cummings, with amazing ideas, but you didn't have the basic organising force of how to, the order in which to do things, who needed to do what. I mean, descriptions of meetings from that period that I've heard, the Prime Minister showing up without a staffer, without any documents. Meetings end, and if a decision's been made, it then gets unpicked because someone else goes and talks to the PM, and an email gets fired off. So there wasn't an ability to do the basic mechanics of wielding power. So that was the failure, basically. And one of Cummings' failures, I think, was that he never grappled with the fact that that's what was happening, and allowed or helped to recruit someone who could have real organising power, perhaps because he would have felt threatened by such a person, to put that critical missing piece into the mix.
But again, some of us would say even if they need a bit of time to be able to put that in place, that COVID came along in March and completely derailed the whole of the government's agenda and
Yes.
also helped the system to kind of push Brexit to the sidelines and get everybody to focus on COVID and the COVID response for 18 months, 2 years.
Yes, that's true. That COVID, few governments have to deal with a situation like that. I mean, I think if you're really a Machiavelli, that sort of event is a massive opportunity for you, because the normal workings of government are suspended. And as we saw with something like the Vaccine Task Force, which was, an incredible body that was convened outside the normal structures of government. It was given a mission, it was given autonomy, and was given funding. And it achieved what no one thought was possible. And that was basically the model for how to actually get things done in the system that we have, which is, really broken and can't get things done. So if you had a plan for, having seen all the wranglings about Brexit and how the institutions of our country were going to thwart any agenda for change, you needed a plan on that model, basically, to achieve what you wanted to achieve, whether that's immigration control, massive investment across the country.
Do you think that can be done within the current system? Do you think that is it as simple as having somebody ultra organised who can get a grip of it, or is the system to such an extent broken and morphed in a way that it just doesn't allow for that type of progress in normal times?
I think you do need a crisis to make it possible. And
to require the fundamental reform, or just to get something done, or both?
To kind of kick your way through the logjam. I mean, I do think if you have a very tough and a political leader with both conviction and who is willing to be fired upon, to have intense criticism and to follow things through, but to do it in a strategic way and to pick battles in the right order and know who's going to come up against you and what their argument's going to be and how are you going to duck that, are you going to fight against it, whether it's immigration control, for example, you're going to get the Treasury saying this, what's your answer to that, and so on.
Do we need something a little bit more radical? Do we need DOGE to be implemented in the UK?
Yes, but this is sort of what I'm talking about. This is a DOGE, model, or a DARPA model, or a Vaccine Task Force model.
Yeah.
And an empowered body that is not grown out of the system that you're trying to change, but that has the backing and it has the strategic thinking behind it to actually move the dial on some major problems.
But how do you do that in practice? I've thought about this long and hard, and the more I've been involved in politics, the more I get frustrated by the processes, and particularly by the arm's length government bodies that seem to control the country today, in my opinion. It does kind of require a chainsaw just to kind of... I don't think you can reform those types of organisations. I think you touched upon it at the beginning, actually, with the rise of the kind of the new Labour state that we're still grappling with today. It feels to me that if you ever actually tried to change anything, the state would write a well-worded note and briefing that said, well, you can't do that because, and the implications of it will be, and the Treasury say X, and the Home Office say Y, and
as
the Environment
you've
Agency
had ample
say Z.
experience of, but you have managed to move the dial on some things.
Some things, but if we're talking on a UK scale rather than on a regional scale, because unfortunately I don't have the power to be able to forego the need to engage with arm's length government bodies. And what's interesting is most of my work to be able to get the things that we've got done in Teesside invariably tends not to be with ministers. It tends to be with chief execs and chairmen of arm's length government bodies who are the ones that actually wield the power. I mean, I remember, I won't do them a disservice, but I remember speaking to a Secretary of State who told me about an arm's length government body that it would be easier for them to change the law than it would be for them as the Secretary of State to tell the arm's length government body what to do. And this is a government body that was apparently underneath the control of this department. I mean, that's the state that this country's in.
Yeah. And
it feels to me that more the Elon Musk kind of Department of Government Efficiency view in the US, which is just getting rid of these things rather than reforming them, how much difference. And to be fair, we've seen a little bit of in Argentina, haven't we? Where, within, I think, a few weeks, they cut a third of all government spending and closed down hundreds of thousands of civil servant jobs and departments. It feels to me like some sort of radical change. In this day and age, does it feel out of reach in Britain? Is it something that we can aspire to and want to see?
I don't think
are we
it's never
too far gone?
It's never out of reach. I don't think we're too far gone. I think almost always something can be rescued, but I think that it requires an extraordinary leader to do it, and not just a leader, but an organization along with that leader that is impervious to the massive firestorm of, assault on the agenda that is going to come with that, but has also done smart thinking about how to deal with it, about who you can get on side, doesn't pick battles for no reason. So, yeah, I do think it can be done. We certainly have no one in government at the moment who I think wants to do that, let alone can do it. Personally, I think Kemi Badenoch could be someone who could do that.
Well, it feels to me like the next 4 or 5 years of this government is going to be extremely difficult. And I would say that, wouldn't I, as a Conservative? But it feels to me like if we were trying to have this conversation with whether a Labour government or more likely potentially a Conservative government today about significant reform of the state, I don't think the system is there to be able to change at the minute. It feels like nobody's done that kind of detailed thinking about exactly how you would change it, what you would do, and then the tactical battles you will have to be able to implement such strategic change. But it also feels to me like the public aren't necessarily in that place at the minute. And it feels to me, if you're thinking politically, that actually the end of 5 years of a Labour government in the direction it seems to be travelling in means that the opportunity for the Conservative Party to get a fair hearing for what is going to be quite radical change, if we're going to do it properly in the way that I think it needs to be done, can only really be done at the end of this cycle, where people kind of recognise what Labour are implementing and push back quite heavily, which gives more of a voice to the centre-right to be able to go back to some more of the more traditional views that we would have on state interference.
I think another way of putting that is that the Conservative Party has to earn the right to be heard again, because God knows they do not deserve it right now. I mean, this was a party in power for 14 years, and everything that a voter of theirs might have wished for went in the opposite direction, except possibly school standards might be.
Well, people say that.
Thing.
I mean, the thing I always push back when people say about, Labour did it very well in the election, 14 years of Tory chaos. It's like, well, it wasn't though, was it? Because we won in 2010, we won in 2015, 17, albeit by different, successes, and we won significantly in 2019. So people were pretty happy with 10 years of a Tory government. So the idea that the public were in a place that at every election we were moving backwards doesn't necessarily play out when we look at the election.
I think the last 2 or 3 of those votes were really votes for change that the public was still convinced the Tories were able to implement.
But they were also being communicated in from a conservative voice. It wasn't done from with a socialist voice, right?
Yes, but I'm not sure. I guess I would dispute that people were expressing happiness with the government. They were expressing a desire for change in the direction that many elements of the Conservative Party wanted to go, but which they didn't deliver on. And so I think that I think there was a massive failure on the economy, on immigration, on defence, on energy policy, and that people since 2016 have basically been saying, we want you to get things done, we want this changed, and their patience ran out with the Conservative Party after a while. I mean, you have to, Labour had lost the argument, on the other side in 2010, so in some ways, I think the Tory party was cruising on a huge loss of credibility among Labour. They had the financial crisis, and then they went down an entire blind alley of Corbyn. So in some ways, the Conservatives got a little lucky with what a complete mess Labour was in. But after none too soon, their luck ran out, and they hadn't been able to give people what people had clearly said they wanted.
And looking forward now, I suppose, where the Conservative Party currently is, do you think Kemi Badenoch Conservative Party is the right direction of travel? Do you think it's likely that she's going to be the next Conservative Prime Minister?
It's probably unlikely, but I do think that political swings now are very different from what they were, and I do think the changes that our politics and economy are going through mean that you can't even rule out a change on that scale. I think she's made a reasonably good start. I think she's right not to go heavy into policy as someone like Rob Jenrick wanted to do, to have a whole argument about the ECHR within the Conservative Party seems to me a completely brainless and indulgent thing to do, because the party is a million miles from power. That's an issue that splits the party.
They have come out just in the last few weeks and said as such, though, now, hasn't she?
Yeah, but I think she's right to say that you can't just put this bauble out in front of people and expect them to come flocking back to you when you've made dozens of promises over years and you've withdrawn the country from a major set of institutional relationships and messed up that process. So to regain any kind of credibility on immigration, which is what that policy is about, you need a policy that takes into account the drivers of immigration, which are economic, how you're going to fix those without importing hundreds of thousands of people a year, what you're going to do about the institutions stopping you from making those changes, judicial or legal advice. And so you need a whole package. And I think that's the argument that Badenoch was making, and I think it's the right one. I don't know I hope she's capable of getting that kind of thinking going, but I don't think now is the time anyway for the Conservative Party to come to the country with some kind of offer on immigration. No one cares what the Conservative Party's offer is right now.
So what do the Conservatives need to be doing right now then?
Well, they need to be doing a mix of the tactical, which is to oppose Labour where they're going wrong, whether that's on their management of migration, on the economy, on how they're going to deal with Trump, or culture war issues, which I think are a bit less salient, but that still needs to be consolidated. The swing against the far left needs to be consolidated.
And is that just reactive?
Yes, that's reactive. That's trying to get heard, which is not easy for an opposition to do, especially on such a huge defeat. And then there's the deep thinking that needs to happen, which happens outside of the headlines, among people who are really willing to grapple with why the party lost and why and to reject reasons why it didn't lose. For example, there's the centrist argument that we need to tack back to the centre and go back to Cameronism or whatever it is, which I think is would be a completely false move. But I do think there needs to be a recognition of what was messed up. And
how does Kemi do that when the parliamentary party is, I think it's fair to say, much more Cameroonian than it is Thatcher?
Well, you're not in the parliamentary party, but you can be part of that conversation. So there are lots of good people around who should be involved in that conversation. And whether it happens through think tanks or through, I don't know, lunches or, in some ways the exact organisation of that doesn't matter. And it will matter when we get closer to an election. The point is that thinking needs to happen. The leadership...
It's a bit self-indulgent now. Should we not be trying to, like you say, rebuild that kind of competence with the country to have a right to be heard? How do we do that if we're sat in dinners and lunchrooms talking philosophically about what it is to be a Conservative? And
I don't think it's
slightly flippant.
It's not a philosophical discussion. Mm. It's a political and policy discussion. It's a kind of post-mortem of what happened and what hit the party and why, and who lost faith.
Do you think it's that complicated? In
the sense that the party didn't deliver what it promised, which is the point I made earlier. That's why, but why didn't it? Why were Conservatives not able to wield power? Which policies didn't stand up to scrutiny, or which parts of the state managed to fight off change, and how would you address that? if you went
Are we
forward.
not at risk, though, of going down that rabbit hole when it's, a simplistic view might be, to play devil's advocate, that actually governing parties across the Western world have struggled post-COVID. Cost of living, people feeling poorer, people feeling opportunities aren't there. You can talk about state spending during COVID, you can talk about policies being followed there, but most Western economies did that. Look at what's happened in the US, look at what's happening in Germany, in France, look what happened in the UK. And it wasn't just on left and right, because obviously we had different parties. It wasn't just kind of everybody moving to the right or everybody moving to the left. It just looks like, again, maybe it might be a simplification, that actually what's happened is people have just rejected those in power because they blame them for the fact that they don't feel better off.
Another way of saying this is that all of these parties have failed and all of these governments are failing. And I think that's true across the developed world, that our institutions are not up to the task of the times, that we have mass migration, we have economic stagnation, we have energy policy that is, nominally, all the drivers of it are wrong. We're shutting down supply before we open up new supply. These are things that are common to many countries, but they're common failures. And, the winner will be those who work out, why did we fail and how can we stop failing? And reform of the state is a big part of that. But I don't believe that there's some kind of almost biological, structural trends just that sweep us in their path, and oh dear, we were so unlucky we got hit by inflation. Well, why did we have inflation? Because we'd underinvested in supply. Then we had a Bank of England which institutionally wasn't up to the job, and massively overstimulated the economy. So these aren't things that just came from heaven, or these are things that our institutions did or didn't do.
And I think one of the things that's different compared to previous elections, well, maybe it isn't, maybe you'll take a different view, Juliet, but we also have Reform now in the mix, which seemed to be a much stronger party, even than, I sometimes compare, I flip between the two things. I sometimes feel like Reform are a bit UKIP 2014, but I also flip between actually Reform are an evolution of that, but sometimes I think that they're not really an evolution of that. They are really reflecting where UKIP were in 2014 around the Brexit issue, and they were a kind of a one-issue thing that kind of really tapped into a failure in the state and people feeling like they're not being listened to. Do you think Reform are something different? Is it something we should be more concerned about, or is it really kind of a flash in the pan that won't be able to be more than just this kind of one-issue protest vote?
If immigration continues at 700,000 a year or even close, there is no way that Reform is a flash in the pan. As to how new they are, I mean, they're new in the sense that this problem keeps getting worse. And they're new in that they're smart in, strategic terms. They are good at using the new tools of politics, social media, and understanding the way ideas spread in ways that other parties could probably learn from. I think where they're quite retro is if you really look at their economic agenda, for example. I mean, it's quite Liz Truss, actually, and she herself was quite...
it's also quite social democratic parts as well.
Well, that's a kind of thing that's tacked on the top, which almost from the continental right-wing parties, that we need to have a kind of...
it's kind of a sop to
a generous
what they think
overlay.
is kind of what people in parts of the Red Wall would want,
Yes,
which is
yes.
slightly kind of left of centre economically.
Yes.
And so you've got quite a Farageist kind of, I suppose, more of a Thatcherite conservative small state. But Reform culturally does extremely well in places like Teesside, for instance, and across the Red Wall. But those people are not necessarily economically aligned with where Farage and Reform want to be.
Yeah, and I think if they were ever really on the cusp of winning power, that would suddenly come into focus. Right now, I don't think it matters particularly for them, because, they're not... People don't have to worry that they're going to come in and end up cutting services because of some massive tax cut they want to do. So I think they're right, actually, politically and actually in policy terms, to go for a stronger state with, elements of social democracy in it. It depends which parts you pick, but I think that would really be a winning formula for them if they went in that direction in a big way. If they took stuff from the SDP, basically, which is, a party that's going nowhere, but has done this sort of thinking, then I think actually they could have a formula for really starting to do damage to Labour, not just the Tories.
Well, they seem to have been doing a bit with the SDP, because I know in the election there were a couple of electoral pacts, particularly in our patch, where the Reform didn't actually stand and allowed the SDP to. So there's definitely...
Was that Rod Liddle?
It was Rod Liddle, yes, down in Middlesbrough South and East Cleveland.
Yes.
I mean, they did nothing. I mean, he got, I think, 1,300 votes or something. Yes. And there were lots of people that wanted to vote Reform. I think Simon Clarke lost by around 100 votes, and there were nearly 1,000 spoilt ballots. So it's not as if people who were going into the ballot box saying, I want to vote Reform, well, if it's not Reform, I'm voting SDP. People don't make that type of link. But I also feel like the reason I always refer to them, well, not always, I've started to think about UKIP 2014, is that it feels to me that there's a bigger opportunity in this of the Conservative Party than there is for Reform. It's almost like we could, as a party, we can kind of steal the Reform clothing on immigration, a bit like we did with Brexit, where we thought, well, the party and certain pressure groups forced Cameron into offering the referendum, being, look, we accept your concerns. You can say the same thing about immigration, right? We accept your concern about immigration, but it's only us that are ever going to actually be in power. So if you want somebody to actually do something about it, we will commit, in effect, to what Reform are saying they're committing to, but we're the ones that can actually do it. Now, Brexit's maybe slightly different because it's an actual thing. It's a we will hold a referendum or we won't. And two, I suppose there is this certainly feeling, both of Labour and Tories at the minute, that there is a lack of trust with the political class if somebody was to stand up and do it. But it feels to me like we could, and it's also more difficult in opposition. In 2014, we were empowered to be able to kind of push through the legislation for a referendum. Do we not feel like if Kemi could get her act together, that there's more of an opportunity to kind of spike Reform before it gets going?
Well, there is, but it goes back to rebuilding credibility. Like I said, no one should care what the Tory party wants to promise on immigration right now, because we've had enough of that. And it turns out immigration was taken to a higher level than anyone had ever thought was possible under the Conservative Party. And so I just don't think until some deeper thinking has been done on it, and the reason that I think the deeper thinking is necessary and not indulgent, as you might call it, is that I don't think you're going to have credibility until there is a plan and a proper analysis of what went wrong and what would convince people that you have changed and that you have learned your lesson. People need to see in an authentic way, and not in just some, we've got to spin a new line now because we've got a vote coming up, that the party's learned its lesson, and you can't pretend you've learned your lesson.
How do we do that other than
by working out a policy, ultimately, and that would work? But you can't do that right now. Like no one wants to look at this policy, so you have to look at what's happened in other countries. How do people feel about it? What are the real problems people are actually experiencing as a result of immigration? On a tactical level, what you can do is start highlighting those and bringing those to the fore, to bring that topic up the agenda. If that's something you want to make a political issue at the next election, there are going to be, I can tell you, and already are, tons of problems as a result of the net immigration that we've seen in the last few years. And what you can do on a national stage is to highlight those problems and find the best examples of what you want to change, and bring those to the fore. But later on, you actually need a policy that would lead to addressing those. Do
you think there are things we can learn from the US and what's happened in the US, or are there lessons to not learn from the US? How do you interpret the result over there, and how could we apply it here, if at all?
I think. I think there are plenty of lessons. I think, there's an appetite for radical change. I mean, it's not just the US, it's all over Europe as well, that, very anti-establishment right-wing parties are surging to the fore. It's actually, this country is an exception in going back to a more social democratic type institution in the Labour Party. I also think one of the very interesting things to come out of the US was the ethnic minority vote for Trump, and the refusing to be pigeonholed by categories that, that media or your opponents want to put on you or on the population. And I think the ability to ignore, huge fusses that actually only occupy small numbers of people inside political bubbles, like the whole kerfuffle over the Madison Square Garden rally, and that comedian who made a nasty joke about Puerto Rico, and it didn't make a difference, and you need to be able to stay focused on what actually matters.
Is that also because the kind of political commentariat and actually the way that the new media influences in the US is more mature than it is in the UK? It also, you've kind of look at your Ben Shapiro's, your Charlie Kirk's, even your Candice Owens. I mean, they're all interesting people, but the reach that they have, which is well beyond the traditional media, and actually the traditional media try and cause them all sorts of problems, they seem to have an undue influence on the election. I mean, your mainstream media over here would talk about your Joe Rogan podcast, which obviously does have influence, right? Because he's got millions of subscribers. It feels to me like we're years behind where the US is, and so will we still be able to drive that message as a Conservative Party using that medium in the same way that Trump did? I'm not sure.
We're behind. I'm not sure how many years behind we are. Right. And I think that one of the things the Conservative Party should try to do is to work out how to accelerate its understanding of this change. I do think actually the way ideas are spreading in our society, as the Brexit referendum showed and as the 2019 election showed, is not in the way that they used to, and that traditional media is less important. It may be to a lesser degree than in the US, but it's still to enough of a degree that it can change the fate of elections.
And I know we don't have much time left, so I suppose when Kemi obviously listens to this podcast on the Con Home website, what's the one piece of advice that you would give her for the next couple of years, or until the next election? What's the big piece of advice you think that she should be taking from you? At least one. You might have a whole host of.
Feels slightly presumptive to give her advice.
Well, I don't know. I think all leaders appreciate advice.
Yeah,
they might not listen to it, but I think actually listening.
I think for her to stay focused on what matters and to let slide what doesn't matter. And I think that's one of her problems, actually.
I was going to say, do you think she can do that? Particularly with the way that the media are going to poke her. They've kind of left her alone at the minute.
I'm hoping she will learn from. So I don't think the media are a good guide to what does and doesn't matter. So I think she's right about that. But I'm not sure her immediate instincts are a good guide either. So by way of example, I think she was 100% right on the David Tennant issue. Major celebrity attacks her out of the blue. The vast majority of the country agrees with her position. She was totally right to go into that battle. But if it's some journalist has written something you don't like, who no one knows who they are, to start waging war on them, whether publicly or privately, it's a complete waste of time. It doesn't serve your purpose. Just focus on what's actually going to win and to get through to the people who matter, and just discard the rest.
Okay. And I always ask this question of guests, so we'll finish on this if it's all right, Juliet. But to you, and this might not be where we are today, it might not have been where we've been over the last 14 years, but to you, what is a Conservative, and where should we be? What should we be trying to communicate to the public as, this is what we are, this is what we stand for, and this is why we're the right people to run the country?
This reminds me of John Hayes' definition of a Conservative, which I think has something to it, which is someone who is born almost from their early awareness as experiencing the loss of things through time, which he claims that he experienced from a young age, this sense of things that we're leaving behind that perhaps we shouldn't. I think that is part of what conservatism is, a sense that there's all this weight of wisdom and history, and it's very beautiful, and that we need to hold on to as much of it as we can, and we do need to reinvent it to serve our purposes, but it should never be just lightly discarded. So I think that's probably at the moment as close as I can come to encapsulating what conservative is. I do think there's actually an element of liberalism in the modern Conservative Party, just from the fact that our institutions have good old liberal principles in them. But I think, they've gone way too far. But I think there's always a tension and a balance between liberalism and conservatism, the individual and the collective, which runs through conservative thinking in how it's been practiced in political terms. So I think you need both to actually enact your ideas in the world. And
how close do you think the Conservative Party over the last 14 years has been to that definition?
Not very close. I actually think since Thatcherism, the party has been obsessed with the idea that conservatism is about individualism, which is not true. The individual is important, but there are collective rights that really matter and that are very conservative. The nation, the family, home, regional loyalties, odd customs that have come down to us that only operate on a collective level. And I think we're really feeling the loss of those things. And I think if you stop looking at the world in that way, you're missing a large part of what's driving people's behaviour.
And do you think the modern Britain, because we have moved away from that to some extent, the Conservatives have allowed that to happen, do you think that's something we can ever get back? Or is it only something we can ever stop from today rather than rewind?
Yeah, we can absolutely get it back. I mean, as long as we're all living in a country and we want to make it work, then there's always the possibility of recreating connections with each other, relationships, institutions. That's part of the human condition, is the possibility to do those things. So yes, we've lost things, but we can always rediscover things or invent new forms for them.
Fascinating. I'm sorry, Juliet, we're going to have to leave it there. I think you've got a nativity to go to this afternoon. I mean, we could sit here and talk for hours. I mean, if anybody hasn't read Juliet's writings, go and pick up a copy of The Time. She's in there all the time. Fascinating read. Give you something to certainly think about, if not to contemplate, Juliet. It's been absolutely fantastic having you on, and hopefully when you get a bit more time after the nativity season, we can get you on for a longer conversation.
Yes, definitely.
Thank you for listening to the Blueprint Podcast, brought to you by Conservative Home with me, Ben Houchin. Remember, you can like and subscribe on all of our social media channels, and you can catch a new episode every single Wednesday wherever you get your usual podcasts from.